The European View Podcast. Your place to navigate the insights of our policy journal, brought to you by the Martenscentre. With Sara Pini.
Hello, and welcome to the European View Podcast, your way to navigate through the main issues of our policy journal with valuable insights from the authors themselves. I'm Sara Pini, the Assistant Editor-in-Chief of the European View and the Senior Research Officer at the Martenscentre. And today we're going to explore the Chinese dimension of the future of transatlantic relation, which was the main topic of the latest issue of the European View. Joining me is Gesine Weber, Research Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Paris. You can find her article, Europe's Transatlantic China Challenge, and all the other articles of the European View on our website, martenscentre.eu. Welcome, Gesine, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with your article. You explore the dilemma that European countries are facing in trying to strike a balance between their relationship with China on the one hand and with the US on the other. And you show that it's not an easy task. What challenges does this dilemma pose, and especially since Trump's re-election?
So let me start with a very general point on Europe's relationship with the United States and China. Very generally speaking, I think it's always important to keep in mind that although Europe has relations with both sides, Europe and the EU have never been equidistant, and that they are treaty allies of the United States via NATO. So I think that this is a very important distinction when we're looking at this relationship between Europe and the United States on the one side and Europe and China on the other side, and this EU-US-China triangle. So I think there's a proximity, of course, to the United States that is much closer than to China. That being said, that doesn't mean that it makes that easier for Europe to navigate this relationship, simply because there is such a significant dependence on China, especially in the economic realm. It's extremely important for European exports, but even more so, and I think that is also what really explains this dependence, for imports to Europe. Because while Europeans have a trade surplus with the United States, they actually have a massive trade deficit with China. And that also means that it is easy for Europe for this to be weaponized eventually. And it creates a strategic dependence. And on the other side, Europeans have obviously not only the economic dependence with the United States, but also the massive security dependence through US security guarantees that have constituted the backbone of European security for years. What is now interesting is that these dependencies have, of course, not changed from one day to another with the Trump election, but they make Europeans potentially reconsider, or they might shift the dynamics that we see in this EU-US-China triangle a bit. What I talk about is, in the article, is that the European-China policy in general always has a transatlantic component, because there is a parallel risk of abandonment and entrapment, meaning that Europeans could be abandoned by the United States, or that the risk of this abandonment could be used to force Europeans to follow the United States and China, and therefore basically design their China strategies by default modeled on the US strategy, which might not necessarily be in Europe's interest, because its relations with China are different than the US relations with China. The big challenge with Trump is that it is not really certain right now how US strategy on China will look like. So Europeans are basically facing a big question mark when they are designing their own China strategies right now, or kind of trying to adapt that, because the key question is how they should accommodate this transatlantic component with a transatlantic policy that is still pretty much in flux. It's almost certain to say that the component of competition between the US and China is going to remain, but how exactly this is going to play out is still to be seen, and hence also a big unknown in European China strategy.
So, of course, you mentioned in your article that the tone in European capitals toward China is already changing, but that at the same time, Europeans still tend to emphasize the importance to keep including China in multilateral cooperation formats, so that they could contribute in maintaining a rules-based global order and global goods such as climate or health. Is this just a European illusion?
I don't think that it is a European illusion. We clearly see that the tone in Europe is changing, and we also see that, for example, Europeans now become much more wary of China's role in supporting Russia's war against Ukraine. That is something that is clearly seen. But on the other hand, there is also a realization that especially global challenges, like, for example, climate change, will not be possible to be addressed if you don't have China on board, simply because it plays a massive role when it comes to setting climate policy, when it also comes to CO2 emissions, for example. It's hard to imagine to come to a solution to Beijing on these goods, but also when you think about, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals and questions of poverty elevation, it's hard to imagine how you can do that without having China on board. And the most promising formats for that are arguably international organizations.
Okay, this is the China side and the US side. Do you think it is realistic that we could bridge the gap in perception and in policies between the two sides of the Atlantic?
That is a major challenge I'm still arguably trying to wrap my head around, because I think that we also see that the United States is currently not extremely involved in international organizations. And we clearly see that there might also be a will from China to take over and present itself as the responsible global power. So I think we also see a certain level of contestation in international organizations between the United States and China. And when the US retreats from these organizations, there's, of course, an interest for China to fill this gap. And I'm convinced that Europeans will arguably try to keep the United States on board in this organization. So the question is just how much this aligns with the views in the organization, in the administration.
Okay, let's move to the question that you already hinted about, security. On China, so long, at least officially, has maintained a neutral position on the war in Ukraine, officially. However, recently, their foreign ministry allegedly, I guess, told Kaya Kallas that Beijing can't accept to see Russia lose, because otherwise the US would just turn its full attention to China. Do you think that this means that we should expect a change in China's stance in the war?
I would not expect a significant change in China's stance, because the war, to some extent, is also a massive strategic dilemma for Beijing. On the one hand, there is this idea that if the war ended and the United States could more quickly withdraw from Europe, that also frees up US capabilities and also US political bandwidth to go all in and really to focus on competition with China and the Indo-Pacific. And that is obviously something that Beijing would not be very keen to see. On the other hand, Russia's invasion of Ukraine really fundamentally violates some key principles that Beijing has been advocating for on the global order and with a lot of countries in the global south for years, which are questions of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And now publicly supporting, let's say, Russia's war against Ukraine and endorsing the Russian position would totally annihilate these efforts. So I don't think that we will see a change in stance, but I think that the current developments will clearly foster or will clearly force Europeans to reconsider their position on China, because for quite a long time there has been this idea that Europeans could travel to Beijing and might potentially move the Chinese position on the war. And if these statements that we have seen coming out of the meeting with Kallas, in fact, are true and reflect the strategic thinking in Beijing, I think this is a massive European disillusion. It will also prompt very different reflections again on the connections between the European and the Asia-Pacific security theaters.
Yeah, this which brings me to my next question, because when we speak about security in Europe, we mainly focus on Russia. But it's clear that Russia is not it's the most visible, but not the only threat to our security. Do you think that as European, we are sufficiently aware and sufficiently integrating the Chinese or more broadly Asian dimension into our discussion when we speak about the future security architecture?
I think that these are two different discussions to some extent, because when we talk about security architecture, this is more the means question. When we talk in terms of grand strategy, this is more like, how are we going to address the security challenges that we are facing? This is about basically the division of labor between institutions, the correct instruments, and all that. But the question of China really goes beyond, because this is also a strategic question. It really requires Europeans to reconceptualize, or in general conceptualize, their approach towards China. The last document that we saw, the Strategic Outlook from 2020, describes China as a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. But we also see that more and more European leaders now tilt more towards the definition of China as a systemic rival and acknowledge that the elements of systemic rivalry are increasing. However, we don't know exactly how this is going to translate into a security strategy, because again, and that brings us back a bit to the beginning of our conversation, a lot on the European security strategy depends on what the United States is doing, on the one hand in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific. The reflections on the connection between the two theaters, Europe and Asia, is certainly increasing, but how exactly they can be linked will ultimately depend significantly on US action. And I think that is precisely Europe's transatlantic China dilemma.
When you speak about European strategy, in reality, what you show in your article is there is not really European strategy. You analyze France, Germany, and the UK, and you conclude that they're kind of driving on site and individually rather than acting strategically and together. So what could facilitate the creation of a common and comprehensive European strategy?
I think that there are two nested challenges in this question. The first question is first that there is no real China strategy on the EU level. There are a lot of regional strategies or strategies for engagement on specific policy areas, but there is no such thing as an EU-China strategy. And for me, the absence of this document is already telling about the significant divergences among EU member states, but also about how complicated it is for Europeans to basically conceptualize this relationship, because it is so multifaceted. And then on the other hand, we have, of course, also the fact that Europeans are especially bound to the United States through NATO. And some European states are very reluctant to have NATO play a bigger role in the Asia-Pacific. And while there was a bigger push for that under the Biden administration, it doesn't look like this is the case under the current Trump administration. So one thing for me is relatively certain, and that is that NATO is not the correct format for designing a European China strategy. But this, again, also then prompts the bigger question: how do we put the UK in this framework, and how can we make sure that UK approaches are aligned with other Europeans? Because Brexit makes it a bit hard to include the UK in an EU strategy, given that it's not a member anymore, and that the relations are just warming up. So besides the fact that the Europeans, in the sense of EU member states, now need to redesign the strategy, the UK actually gets the extra challenge of not only basically having to balance a triangle, which is EU, US, China, but basically finding itself in a weird square or four-angle constellation with UK, EU, US, China relations, and especially in light of trade relationships, this is not going to be easy.
Yeah, trade for sure, because that's a EU competence, but maybe in defense, because uh, already during Brexit, they were expressing the will to keep, cooperating on defense and security, and even more since Russia's latest aggression to Ukraine, they have been cooperating with us. So, do you think that there is another format that we could use to include them?
I think that the EU-UK Security Pact is a very good starting point to do that. But we also see in this Security Pact that it is basically a very minimal first step. It's good for warming up the relationships again. But when we're looking at this EU-UK Security Pact, we see that it is mostly about closer coordination on. So what now needs to happen is not just talking the talk, but also walking the walk and underpinning all these nice coordination ideas with actual policy. I think when it comes to China, there are a few obvious elements where cooperation between the EU and the UK is to some extent a low-hanging fruit. For example, when it comes to cyber security questions, when it comes to hybrid threats, when it comes to resilience. But overall, the China question is so much of a geopolitical and a systemic question that we also see that EU member states already fail to get to a common position. And before this can happen, I don't see that there could be anything like a more comprehensive cooperation. On the very short term, it is going to go most likely through bilateral relations between the UK and EU member states.
Thank you very much, Gesine. Maybe you should write another article next year to see how things are developing.
I'm tempted.
So thank you for this interesting discussion, and thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you for having me.
And for those listening in, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and discover all the interesting insight of the European view on our website, martenscentre.eu, and on all our social media channels. Thank you, and stay tuned for more.
This was the European View podcast, your place to navigate the insights of our policy journal. Follow the Martens Centre for more.